in this presentation we're looking at the art of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Now the thing is, of course, that both of these artists were in the Renaissance period that we've been talking about. And so there's some differences that begin to happen during the Renaissance. So you can see here that we've got a picture that this is not Michelangelo or Da Vinci, but what we can see here is that this is Raphael. And in this painting, which is called School of Athens, we see some differences. And if you take a look at this particular painting, you should notice a few things. One is that it's not religious, particularly. This actually shows a scene from a school of philosophy in Greece. So because the Renaissance is looking at the classics and going back to the time period where they thought it was the most, sort of the best developed, they are looking at a scene here from ancient Greece. And you should notice a number of things here in your picture. One thing that you should notice are these two figures here in the center. Now these two guys are Aristotle and Plato. So we've got Plato here on the left, he's the older guy, and Aristotle there on the right. And you notice where they are in the picture, they're right there in the center. The other thing that's really interesting about this one is that we've got these series of arches. So you should notice a number of arches here. There's a big one that goes all the way across like that. And all of these end up helping us to notice these two guys in the center. It's not a religious piece. A lot of medieval art would have focused on religious themes, Bible stories, or pictures of Jesus, or pictures of Mary and Jesus. But here we see that instead they've gone actually to a time of paganism. A few other things about this picture that are pretty interesting. You should notice that it's symmetrical. It's well balanced. And you can see that here in these two areas. So we see a statue over here. We see another statue over here. We have a lot of similar kinds of groupings. We have a group on this side of the picture and a group on this side of the picture. A lot of similar kinds of objects on either side. So they balance each other out. Also, you should notice that there's a lot of geometric shapes. So here we see squares that are focused on, and we see a geometric pattern that goes through the middle of the arch there. So this is pretty typical of Renaissance art, and you can see here that Raphael is using a lot of these same kinds of things. Another interesting thing is an emphasis on a different perspective. If you were to look at medieval art, you'd see that a lot of it seems to be sort of two-dimensional, very, very flat. And as we get into the Renaissance period, we start to see that they're trying to create a three-dimensional kind of space, so something that looks like depth and new perspective. So you can see here that in this particular drawing, they're just showing a drawing of a chalice, which is kind of like a drinking vessel that you might use in communion or the Lord's Supper. But you can see that it's all very balanced, that they've tried to draw this very geometrically, but also that there's some depth and as you look at this, a kind of a 3D sort of effect. Well, as we get into the Renaissance, of course, they're even interested in theologians that are from the past. So in this particular painting, this one's about Augustine, who of course was a 4th century theologian, very famous and of course very important to church history. But they see him as someone who's sort of classical in the idea. So going back to the sources, the source of even church theology is in our church fathers here. All right, well, let's take a look at these particular artists that are representative of the Renaissance age. The first one is Michelangelo. And we're not talking, of course, about the Ninja Turtles. We're talking about the artist. Michelangelo was born in 1475. One of the things that's important to keep in mind with Michelangelo is that he lives during the same time as the beginning of the Reformation. So here we can see that the Renaissance and the Reformation are actually going to overlap. They're going to have similar influences on them. So here we've got Michelangelo's birthplace. He's in Caprice in Italy. It's interesting because it's the same town that famous confrontation between Henry IV and Gregory VII happened, where Gregory is inside the castle and Henry IV is standing in the snow waiting to be let in. And here we can see that we've got a painting by, well, actually a guy by the name of Domenico Ghirlandaio in Florence. And this is a guy that Michelangelo worked with. He was apprenticed to him, actually. And he was a painter. This is a painting of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, and you can see at the top of the painting we've got supposed to be a representation of God the Father surrounded by angels, and the idea here that Jesus is being baptized, God is showing his approval of that. But even though Michelangelo works with Ghirlandaio in Florence, he much prefers sculpture to painting. He does do some painting, as we'll see, of course, but more interested in sculpture. One of the things that's important about Renaissance art is the way that it was being paid for. And of course, earlier on in medieval art, mostly it's the church that's buying the art or paying for the art, because most of the art that's being done is being done to be displayed in church, maybe altarpieces or some kind of icons. But in this case, we've got a very wealthy family. The Medici family were a banking family that lived in Florence in Italy. They virtually ruled the city because they were so rich. And they're going to be really, really influential in art. So Cosimo Medici is very interested in languages. He studies Greek himself and is interested in encouraging the study of ancient languages. Lorenzo Medici, his grandson, is what we call a patron of the arts. So these are people who actually pay artists in order to have art done. And Lorenzo himself is going to employ Michelangelo. Now, during the same time that Michelangelo is doing art, he is pretty well influenced by this guy named Savonarola, who we'll be looking at as well in our course. And Savonarola was a Dominican monk who preaches against the abuse of power that Lorenzo Medici and his family have. He's also, he speaks a lot against art and wealth and so on. So he was trying to change the church by doing away with the extreme wealth. And Michelangelo is somewhat influenced by Savonarola, and he's not sure whether he wants to divide his time so much between the beauty that he sees in the world, the physical beauty that he shows in his art, and the spiritual goodness that he sees that Savonarola is talking about. Well, Michelangelo has to get out of Florence. There's some changes happening, of course, because of Savonarola preaching against them, and the Medicis are forced out of Florence, and of course it's the Medicis that are paying Michelangelo's salary. So he has to flee, and so he goes to Bologna, where he's going to work with sculpture. Here we see a couple of the sculptures that were known to have been done by Michelangelo. We can see his angel there on the right and his young soldier there on the left. Michelangelo also makes friends with a few people who are going to help his thinking. So we have Vittoria Colonna, who is a widow, who introduces him to a couple of pretty important people. Now, these two guys underneath here, we've got Juan de Valdez and Bernardo Aquino. Both of these are still Catholics. They don't leave the Catholic Church, but they are going to be people who are wanting to reform the church and start to bring a more of a Christ-centered approach to not only to Michelangelo's art, but also just to the church. Michelangelo goes to Rome, and while he's there, he produces his famous Pieta. That's the sculpture that's on the left. Now, this is a pretty common topic for art. You can see that it's Mary, and she's holding the body of Jesus on her lap there. The one on the right is by Botticelli, and of course one is a sculpture and one is a painting, but I just want you to see if you can see some of the differences between the two pieces of art. You might notice not only is one a sculpture, one's a painting, but also the number of people involved. So the one on the left, just Mary and Jesus. The one on the right also involves other women as well as various disciples. The attitude in there is quite different as well. You can see that one seems to be great distress and mourning. It looks like Mary's about to fall over because of her grief, where in the one on the left it's more quiet, a little bit more contemplative, and interestingly, just the age that Mary appears to be. The one on the left, she appears to be quite young. So she's still sort of seen as that young mother that she was at the beginning. Whereas in the right, she almost has the appearance of a nun or an older woman, which is quite interesting. Now Michelangelo goes back to Florence, and while he's there, he does do some painting. Here he's got his famous Holy Family painting where you've got Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus, and this is supposed to be as they're fleeing to go to Egypt. But one of the things quite interesting is just this kind of the geometric form. You can see that Mary here is showing her muscles, which may appear kind of funny, but it shows that Michelangelo has studied human anatomy and structure, and so here he's showing Mary as very physical, not just some of the figures in the Middle Ages make Mary to be almost otherworldly, and here you can see that she's a real person, a real mother. Of course, Michelangelo is most famous for his sculptures of David and Moses. The one of David is an interesting one because it was made from a piece of marble that nobody else wanted, no other sculptor wanted, because it had a particular flaw. And Michelangelo was able to work around that, and he produces this massive statue of David from the Bible, and it's considered to be one of his masterpieces. The one on the right is Moses, and you might notice something interesting about that. First of all, Moses is actually just one of the figures that was supposed to be on the tomb of Pope Julius. And Pope Julius was that pope that Erasmus makes fun of in his play Julius Excluded from Heaven, but he had commissioned Michelangelo to sculpt his tomb. And one of the figures is Moses. Now you'll notice that on Moses' head, he's got what appear to be horns coming out. Now, that's not a mistake. He's not trying to make him into something, some fanciful kind of creature. In the original Vulgate Bible, when Jerome translates the Vulgate, and there's the story of Moses coming down from the mountain after being up on Mount Sinai with God. And of course, in our Bibles, it says that Moses' face shone brightly, so much so that he had to cover his face because people couldn't look at them. Well, Jerome, when he translated that, the word for shining was similar to the word for having horns. And so for a long time, whenever you'd see a painting or a piece of artwork that shows Moses, it would show him with horns because that's what the Vulgate actually says about him. So in Michelangelo's Moses, Moses has horns, which is rather amusing. Now, a lot of you would have seen or have heard of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is just one of the churches there in Rome, and if you go inside, it's a pretty small chapel actually, but the whole ceiling and walls and everything have been painted by Michelangelo. The top of it shows the creation of the world, and then it tells the story of the fall. So here in this picture you can see this is Adam and Eve being sent out from the garden after they've sinned. This panel over here is actually God creating Adam. So this part over here is the figure of God, and this is supposed to be Adam, and then the story goes along to tell the fall. Now at the one end here, the wall down here, we see Christ in judgment, so it shows Christ judging all of humanity, and some people going to heaven and some people going to hell. But it's a beautiful painting. Now when Michelangelo painted this, he painted it up on scaffolding, and he had to lay on his back looking up at the ceiling, and of course it meant that his eyes were in an unnatural position trying to watch the ceiling. And so they sort of froze that way for a while. Eventually they did settle back down again, but it meant that it actually damaged his vision for a while. Here's a few more of the details from the Sistine Chapel. You can see here's the picture of God reaching out to create Adam, and this is a detail of Adam here. This is Christ in judgment, and you can see here on the left, very typical that Mary is there sort of at his right hand. Interesting, but it shows you how much Catholicism had affected art. Just got this bit in here just to show you that how the cleaning of these walls can really affect it. So the one on the left here, the same picture, but the one on the left before it's been cleaned, and the one on the right after all the dirt and oils and so on that have built up over the years are taken away. So that's Michelangelo. You can see this is one of his later works, perhaps an unfinished work here with the crucifixion of Peter. And some of you know that in legend, Peter is crucified upside down. And so here we see Peter being put on the cross and about to be crucified upside down. So one of his later works, perhaps unfinished. All right, well, let's move on to Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is actually born before Michelangelo, and this is just one of his sketches showing a landscape of where he grew up. Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1518, and we're going to see that Martin Luther nails his famous 95 Theses in 1517, just 500 years from where we are now, away from where we are now, and so Leonardo da Vinci just dies shortly after that. He also was apprenticed, so most of you would know that if you were going to be an artist, you usually had to find someone who would teach you. And so he's apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchi, and he's involved in making paint, and he'd prepare the surfaces to paint with plaster, because in those days, one of the things about Renaissance art was that they began to use the technique of frescoes where you would paint directly into wet plaster. One of the things that's true about Da Vinci is that he begins to use oil paint instead of just the egg tempera. Egg tempera tends to come off quite light, but whereas oils can make very rich color. And you can see that in this particular one on the left-hand side, this angel here was actually done by Da Vinci. And you can see some of the richness of the fabric that was used here. Interesting that it happens to be the same subject matter. We've got Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, and instead of a figure of God this time you just have hands here at the top and the dove representing the Holy Spirit. This is perhaps Leonardo da Vinci's first great painting, the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and announces to her that she's about to have a baby. One of the interesting things about Renaissance art is that there's so much detail in it. So rather than just a plain background where you would then just only really see the figures, here we can see that we've got trees in the background. There's kind of a landscape. They're sitting by a building. It looks like a real place, everyday objects around for that time period. And we've got this angel holding his hand up in greeting there, and Mary's looking surprised. It's a Renaissance style home, so it sets the scene in a typical kind of building and scene from the day. Some interesting things about it. It's not quite right. Mary's arm here is a little bit unnaturally long, so he doesn't quite have all of his perspective right, but this is kind of seen as his first of his great paintings. He goes into an artist guild at age 20, so a guild would have been where you would you work with other artists, and it was sort of a business group, if you like. It gave him a chance to work independently rather than under a master, and he'd be the apprentice. He tended to get distracted from his work, and so you see quite a lot of unfinished work by Da Vinci in some of his early work. This is Jerome in the Wilderness. Jerome, of course, the one who translated the Vulgate and lived as pretty much a hermit in the desert, in the catacombs in Bethlehem for quite a while. Now, I really like Da Vinci's Mysterious Ladies, and this is perhaps my favorite one, Portrait of Ginevra Benci. I've seen this one quite a lot because it was the only Da Vinci that is outside of Europe, and it's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., where I used to go quite a lot. Now, her name means juniper, and so there's a juniper bush in the background there. And the fact that she's facing the viewer, a lot of times you would see artists paint portraits, but they would have it kind of as a side profile, and instead she's looking more face on, which is unusual for the day. Da Vinci does a number of Madonna and child pictures. So Madonna is Mary and with Jesus, and so there's a number of different paintings of that. This one on the right is interesting. It's Madonna and Saint Anne. Saint Anne is supposed to be the mother of Mary, so this would be Saint Anne in the background, and Mary and Jesus, and here you see the lamb. But the interesting thing about this particular one is that, again, we have these geometric shapes, and this one's sort of in the shape of a triangle. So you can see here that's quite common in Renaissance art. Again, more unfinished works by Da Vinci. Some of it is, I suppose, that he got bored or just lost interest. The one on the left is the Adoration of the Magi, so the wise men coming to see Mary and Jesus. And the one on the right was supposed to be this massive bronze horse that was going to be cast. Now, he had a patron, Sforza, in Italy, but unfortunately war broke out and he was unable to cast the figure into bronze. So it was modeled in clay. This one was produced based on drawings and so on years later. So it's not his original one, but it is based on his drawings. And of course, Da Vinci was what we call a universal man or true Renaissance man because he had so many gifts, not only painting and sculpting, but also engineering and mathematics. And here we can see that he's got some ideas for a number of inventions that were well before his time. So the one on the left is kind of a water lifting device, what you might see at a mill. And the ones on the right, we have an early helicopter at the top, and the bottom one is kind of an early tank where soldiers would hide in there. One of the interesting things I once saw was his idea to have underwater armies. So he had basically diving suits that he had devised with breathing apparatuses. Nobody really wanted to try it. He tried to talk the city of Venice into buying a lot of those or letting him make them for their armies so that they could rise up from the water whenever Venice was attacked. But they didn't do it. Now, this, of course, is perhaps one of his most famous. This is the Last Supper, painted in fresco, and it was a new style. So he was trying something a little bit different, and unfortunately, it didn't work too well because it began to deteriorate fairly quickly. So it's had to be restored a number of times. It's actually painted in the wall of the dining room of a monastery, and so if you visit the monastery, it's not a painting on a canvas where you can take it off the wall. It's actually painted right onto the wall. And one of the interesting things about this particular painting is that it included Judas. Now you have to look a little bit and see if you can figure out which one is Judas. You can figure out which one is Jesus, but perhaps there's one good clue as to which one Judas is. So you just take a second, see if you can figure out which one you think it is. Well, Judas is actually this one here on the left, and the reason they know is because he's holding a money bag. Well, the money bag, of course, is the 30 pieces of silver that Judas was paid in order to betray Jesus. This figure here is thought to be John, and this one here is thought to be Peter. And of course, you can see some of the deterioration that's already happening with this particular fresco with Jesus, and you can see that it's faded. And it has been restored a number of times, but of course there's some damage that you can't restore. One of the things that's interesting are the sketches that Da Vinci did in order to prepare for this particular painting. And he would go out in the street and he would just draw everyday ordinary people, and those would be his models. Well, of course, the most famous of Da Vinci's work is the Mona Lisa. And you're going to be looking at some of that in your book with a description of that. So I won't go into that now, but just a few things to remember then about some of the differences that you'd see between the medieval and the Renaissance art, and then just a few of the works by this most famous artist of the day.